My name is Iris Callahan. I'm 28 years old, and the day my husband's family locked me out of the house we shared together, I understood something I wish I'd learned sooner. In certain families, the person who cries the loudest gets believed the fastest, and the person who stays calm gets blamed the hardest. My sister-in-law was already inside when it happened. I remember the sound of the deadbolt turning from the wrong side. I remember standing on the porch with my car keys still in my hand, thinking I had maybe grabbed the wrong key, maybe the lock had jammed, maybe there was some ordinary explanation that would make this make sense. Then I heard her voice through the door, high and theatrical, telling my mother-in-law that she'd found something, that I had been lying, that she had known all along something was wrong with me. My mother-in-law didn't call me in to ask. My father-in-law didn't open the door to hear my side. The next voice I heard was my father-in-law saying, loud enough that the neighbor's dog looked up from across the street, that I was not welcome in his son's home until this was resolved, and that they would be calling their son themselves. Their son. My husband. Theo. I stood on that porch for probably 4 minutes. Then I walked back to my car, sat in the driver's seat without starting the engine, and stared at the dashboard until my hands stopped shaking. The thing my sister-in-law had found was a screenshot. She claimed it showed me flirting with someone from my old office, someone she described as a close friend of a woman Theo had briefly dated before we met. She said it proved I was still in contact with people I'd promised Theo I had no reason to talk to anymore, that I was secretly maintaining connections that crossed a line, that the whole marriage had been built on a version of me that wasn't real. There was no screenshot, or rather, there was a screenshot, but it wasn't what she said it was. I knew that the moment she described it. I also knew that knowing it wasn't enough because she had been building this narrative for 2 years, piece by piece, in the slow and patient way that people who are genuinely frightened of losing their position tend to operate. I drove to my friend Simone's apartment. She lived 20 minutes away in a building with a broken elevator and a superintendent who had apparently been meaning to fix it since 2019. She opened the door before I knocked because I had texted her from the parking lot and she had been watching from the window. That was the kind of friend Simone was. She had a blanket on the couch already. She did not say everything would be fine because she was too smart for that and she knew me too well. She just handed me a glass of water and sat down next to me and waited. I told her everything. The locked door, my sister-in-law's voice, my father-in-law's words, the screenshot accusation. When I finished, Simone was quiet for a moment. Then she said, that level of preparation doesn't happen in an afternoon. She's been waiting for a reason, and if she didn't find one, she was eventually going to build one. I wanted to argue, mostly because arguing felt better than accepting what she was implying. Simone leaned forward. She asked me one question. She said, what was she scared of losing? I didn't have an answer. Not then, but that question was the thing that kept me from accepting the locked door as the end of the story. Theo called me that night. He sounded exhausted and confused and, I could tell, had been on the phone with his family for hours before he called me. He did not accuse me. He also did not defend me immediately, and that gap, that pause before he spoke, was the loneliest 2 seconds of our marriage. He said he needed a few days to think. I said okay. I hung up and sat with the word okay for a long time, because it was the smallest, most controlled thing I had ever said when I wanted to say something enormous. I stayed at Simone's. I slept on her couch, which had a cushion that tilted slightly to the left, and a throw pillow with embroidery that pressed into my cheek all night. It was not comfortable. It was also the only place I felt safe enough to sleep at all. On the second morning, I made coffee in Simone's kitchen and tried to think like someone who wasn't devastated. I thought about my sister-in-law, about what Simone had asked, about what she might have been protecting when she made that move. She had always been the gravitational center of Theo's family. She organized every holiday. She called his mother every day. She had an opinion about every decision Theo had made since I entered the picture, and most of those opinions were delivered to his parents before they were ever delivered to him. I had always tried to stay patient with that, because Theo loved her and she was his family, and I understood that some people need to feel central to survive. What I hadn't understood, not fully, was what it looked like when that need got threatened. I called my old colleague Adeline. We had worked together for 3 years before I changed jobs, and she was methodical and careful and had a memory for detail that made her slightly terrifying in project reviews. I asked her if she remembered anything unusual happening around the last company holiday party, which was when the screenshot supposedly showed me doing something inappropriate. She was quiet for a second. Then she said, "Actually, yes." She remembered that my sister-in-law had been there, not as a guest of mine, as a plus one for someone else in the company's extended circle, a connection through a board member's family. It had been brief, she'd seen her near the entrance, but she remembered because my sister-in-law had seemed very interested in where I was seated and who I was talking to. I sat with that for a minute. If she had been there, she hadn't mentioned it to me or Theo. That wasn't necessarily suspicious on its own. What was suspicious was that the screenshot she described, the one supposedly showing me talking to someone I shouldn't have been, was from a work context I had never discussed with his family at all. How did she know who that person was unless she had seen us together herself? Simone said, "So she was there, she saw something that looked like nothing, and she held on to it for months until she needed a version of it that looked like something." That was the second crack. There was a woman from my former company named Odette. She handled communications and knew every layer of that office's social geography better than most people knew their own apartments. She had also, at some point, sat on a nonprofit committee with my sister-in-law. I hadn't thought about that overlap in over a year. I contacted her through a mutual connection and asked if she'd be willing to meet. She agreed, but when we sat down at a coffee place near the waterfront, she had the expression of someone who already regretted agreeing. She gave me generalities. She said my sister-in-law was well-connected. She said charity work brought people together. She said sometimes personalities clashed. I put down my cup and looked at her directly. I told her I hadn't been accused of a personality clash. I'd been locked out of my own home. She stirred her drink. She lowered her voice. She said, "Your sister-in-law started asking questions about you about 8 months ago, not loudly, just quietly, the kind of questions that plant seeds without looking like planting. She asked which colleagues you were close to. She asked whether you'd seem distracted at any point. She asked whether the men in your office knew you were married." My chest went very still. That last one. Whether the men in my office knew I was married. That was not curiosity. That was reconnaissance. Odette gave me one more piece before she clearly decided she had said enough. She said there was a woman my sister-in-law had become close with recently, someone who had briefly worked at my former company as a contractor before moving on. A woman named Phoebe. She said if I wanted to understand the timeline better, Phoebe had been in the room for a lot of it. I found Phoebe through a professional network. We met in a parking garage because she genuinely did not want to be seen having this conversation. She was nervous and direct, and had clearly been thinking about what she wanted to say long before she arrived. She told me without much preamble that my sister-in-law had approached her specifically because Phoebe had briefly overlapped with me professionally and had asked her to describe my working relationships in detail. She said she had told her nothing because there was nothing to tell, but that the level of specificity in the questions had surprised her. She said my sister-in-law had been particularly interested in one male colleague who had helped me on a project during a stretch when Theo and I had been navigating a rough patch in our first year together. There it was. She had found the time when things had been hard between us and built the accusation backward from it. Phoebe also said something that made the whole shape of it clear. She said my sister-in-law had seemed less interested in finding proof and more interested in making sure a story existed. She said she wasn't investigating, she was writing. I sat in my car after that conversation for a long time. The problem was still the same one I'd had at the beginning. I had impressions and conversations and a timeline that pointed clearly in one direction. But I did not have anything that couldn't be explained away. My sister-in-law had cried in front of Theo's mother. She had history on her side. She had access and trust I had spent 2 years trying to earn without ever quite closing the gap. I needed something that didn't care how convincingly she performed. That night, Simone asked me how I was feeling, and I told her I was trying not to feel anything until I had something real. She told me that was probably the most practical sentence she'd ever heard me say, which was either a compliment or a diagnosis. I went back to the beginning, the screenshot. What had actually been photographed, whatever it actually showed, she'd had to have gotten it somehow, and she had not been someone I'd ever directly shared my work communications with. The only way she could have it was if she had either taken it herself from a device she shouldn't have accessed, or if someone at the party had taken it and sent it to her separately. I thought about the party. I thought about who had been nearby when I spoke to my former colleague. I thought about whether anyone there had been paying attention to me specifically, and I thought about Adeline's comment that my sister-in-law had been watching where I was seated. Then I remembered something I had forgotten entirely until that moment. There had been a company photographer at that party, not a professional, just a person in our communications department who always volunteered to document events for the newsletter and internal archive. She had been moving through the room all night with a camera that had a flash that occasionally startled people. I remembered it because it had startled me at one point while I was mid-sentence to someone, and I had laughed and made a comment about it. That camera existed. Those photos existed. And they would have a timestamp. I reached out to my old communications department contact carefully. I did not explain why I needed it. I said I was looking for photos from the holiday party for a personal memory project, which was vague enough to be true and not alarming. She sent me a folder link 2 days later, with the note that the archive was open to all former staff anyway. I opened every photo from that night. I looked at each one with a timestamp in the corner, and I searched specifically for any photo where both my former colleague and I were visible together. There were 3. In all 3, we were standing near a buffet table with 4 or 5 other people, fully in a group context, with no proximity or posture that suggested anything other than people at a work party talking about work things. The timestamp showed the conversation lasted approximately 11 minutes across 2 separate moments. But that wasn't the important part. The important part was the 4th photo, one that included my sister-in-law in the background. She was clearly visible in the frame, and she was looking directly at me. Her body was turned toward the entrance, but her head was angled back, and her eyes were on me and my former colleague. The timestamp on that photo was 3 minutes before the first of the photos that included both of us. She had been watching before she had anything to watch. She had positioned herself to observe, and somehow, from that observation, she had constructed a screenshot that I had still never seen, but that her account of suggested she had captured from a phone, not from the official archive, which meant someone at the party had photographed us independently and given that photo to her. I asked Adeline if she remembered anyone else using a phone camera that night near where I had been standing. She thought for a moment. Then she said actually yes. There was someone from a different department she didn't know well, a temporary hire who had left the company before the new year. She described him, and I did not recognize the description, but she remembered because he had been taking what seemed like a lot of photos for someone who was technically only there as a fill-in. She said she could probably find out who he was through a former colleague in HR who might still have temp contract records. She came back to me with a name the next day, and that name, when I searched it, had a connection I had not expected. He had done logistics contracting for a community foundation, the same community foundation where my sister-in-law sat on a volunteer committee. He had been in that room because of her, and whatever he had photographed had gone directly to her. Simone said, so she planted someone at a party you didn't know she knew about, had him photograph a completely ordinary conversation, and then constructed a story around an image that was real but meant nothing. Yes, I said. Simone said, do you know how much effort that takes? I said I was beginning to. I still had a choice about what to do with it. I could go directly to Theo, I could go to his parents, I could confront my sister-in-law. Each of those felt like handing her an opportunity to perform her way out of it, because she had shown she was very good at that and I was not going to win a crying competition. So I chose the one thing she hadn't prepared for. I built a document, not dramatic, not a manifesto, just a clear and ordered record of what I knew, where I'd gotten it, and what the photos showed. Adeline agreed to provide a written account of what she observed that night, including my sister-in-law's presence at the party and her positioning near the entrance. Odette provided a careful written summary of the questions my sister-in-law had asked about me. Phoebe wrote down the conversation they'd had, including the specific details she'd been asked about. The archive photos were attached with their timestamps annotated. The Community Foundation connection was documented separately. The temp contractor's name, his connection to my sister-in-law's volunteer committee, the timeline of when he had been hired and when he had attended the party. I sent it to Theo first. Not his parents. Not his sister. Theo. He called me 17 minutes after I sent it. He didn't say much for the first 30 seconds. Then he said, "She was at the party." "Yes," I said. He said, "She never told me that." "No," I said. He was quiet again. Then he asked me if I wanted to come home. I told him I needed him to understand what had been built before I walked back through that door. Not because I needed to win, because I needed him to see it clearly so it couldn't be explained away later. He said he understood. I think he meant it. I know he was trying to. I did not go home that night. I went the following afternoon after Theo had spoken to his parents, and they had spoken to his sister, and when I arrived, I could tell from the way the house felt that something had shifted, the particular silence of a place where a confrontation has recently happened. My mother-in-law met me in the kitchen. She looked like she had been crying, but not the way people look when they're genuinely grieving, more the way people look when they have been caught doing something they thought was invisible and are now figuring out what comes next. She said she wanted to apologize. She said they had reacted too quickly. She did not say they had been wrong to trust my sister-in-law. She did not say that locking me out of my own home without hearing one word from me was something she was ashamed of. Too quickly, I repeated back to her. She looked uncomfortable. Not cruelly, not shamefully, just too quickly. She started to say something about how much she loved her daughter and how this was a difficult time for everyone, and I put my hand up. Not rudely, just enough to stop the sentence. I told her that the next time someone brought her a story about me, she could ask me one question before she changed the locks. Just one. She had my number. She had always had my number. She didn't have an answer for that. My father-in-law was not in the room for that conversation, which I noticed. My sister-in-law was. She was sitting in the living room when I came through, and she had the posture of someone who had been told to stay put and was not happy about it. She looked like herself, but without the particular steadiness she usually performed. I had never seen her uncertain before. It was a strange thing to see on a face I had looked at across family dinner tables for 2 years. She didn't speak first, so I did. I told her that I wasn't there to have an argument and I wasn't going to have one. I told her that I knew about the party. I knew about the photographer. I knew about the questions she'd been asking for 8 months. I told her that whatever she had been afraid of, she had chosen the method that had not been as invisible as she thought. She said, "I was trying to protect my brother." I said, "From what?" She opened her mouth. Then she closed it, and in that pause I saw the thing she had never planned to be seen. The absence of an actual answer. She had been protecting Theo from a story she had decided was true before she had evidence it was, because the story made her necessary and my presence had been quietly rearranging a dynamic she relied on. I wasn't angry in that moment. I was just very, very tired. I told her that protecting someone didn't look like building a case behind their back. It didn't look like planting someone in a room to photograph their spouse. It didn't look like locking a person out of their home without letting them speak. She said nothing, so I turned and walked toward the kitchen to find Theo. Behind me, I heard her stand up. I heard her take a breath, the kind of breath that usually precedes a performance. Then I heard her sit back down, and somehow that was more telling than anything she could have said. Theo was standing by the back window with his hands in his pockets. He looked like a person who had recently learned something that had rearranged several things he thought he knew. He turned when he heard me. He didn't reach for me immediately, but he held my gaze, and that felt like honesty. He said he was sorry. I believed him. not because sorry fixed anything, but because his face told me he had been sitting with what sorry meant for the past 24 hours and hadn't taken any shortcuts. We talked for a long time that evening. Not about his sister. About us. About the year before things went sideways, about the rough patch we'd navigated, about what he had needed during that time and what I had given him and what I had held back because I was trying to be low maintenance when I should have just been real. Some of that was uncomfortable. None of it was dishonest. It was the most direct conversation we'd had in maybe 18 months, and it happened because a locked door had forced the long way around back to the truth. I would not recommend that method. What happened to the document I had sent wasn't contained. Theo's cousin, who had been texted by my mother-in-law in a moment of panic that first evening, had already shared pieces of it with 2 other family members before anyone asked her not to. The temp contractor's foundation connection became something 2 people on that volunteer committee heard about and quietly passed along. My sister-in-law resigned from that committee within the following month, citing a scheduling conflict that she had apparently suddenly discovered. I didn't run around talking about any of this. I did not need to. Once something is written down and it tells a clear story, it finds its own audience, Simone said. Documentation is just truth with receipts. She was right. About 6 weeks later, Adeline sent me a message out of nowhere. She said she'd heard through someone at her current company that the temp contractor had quietly declined to be used as a reference by someone else applying for foundation work. She didn't know the specifics. She just thought I should know. I thought about him briefly and then let it go. He had probably not understood what he was building when he agreed to take those photos. That didn't make it nothing. It also didn't make it the part I needed to carry. Phoebe texted me once after everything settled down. She said she was glad she'd talked to me. She said she hoped things were okay. I told her they were getting there, which was the truest answer I had. Things with Theo's family remained complicated. That's the honest version. My mother-in-law and I had a surface-level courtesy that was better than what it had been and worse than what it should have been. My father-in-law shook my hand at a family dinner about 2 months later in a way that seemed intended to communicate something, though I was never entirely sure what. My sister-in-law and I occupied the same rooms at holidays with a careful distance that everyone pretended not to notice, and everyone noticed completely. Theo and I were okay. That's also the honest version. We weren't perfect. The locked door had revealed some things that had nothing to do with his sister, and we had to deal with those too, and dealing with them was slower and less dramatic than building a document case and significantly more work. But he was honest with me in a way that I had stopped expecting right around the time things had gotten hard, and finding it again felt like something worth staying for. Some nights I thought about my sister-in-law and the amount of energy she had spent on something that hadn't worked. The months of questions. The party contact. The photograph she'd had taken of a conversation that was exactly what it appeared to be. That kind of effort requires a specific type of fear. The kind that doesn't look like fear from the outside because it wears the costume of loyalty and protection and just caring too much. I understood it better than I wanted to. What I didn't understand, what I sat with longer, was how fast a door could be locked. How little it took. One cry, one screenshot described but never shown. One family with a habit of closing ranks before asking questions. 4 minutes on a porch I had stood on 100 times before, and I was suddenly outside looking in. The porch was the same, the key was the same, I was the same. The only thing that had changed was that someone had decided this story needed me outside. I think about that sometimes. Not with bitterness, not most of the time, but with a kind of clarity I didn't have before. People will construct the version of events that costs them the least. They will believe the story that requires the fewest uncomfortable questions. And when you hand them proof, they don't suddenly become sorry they believed a lie. They become sorry they got caught doing it. Those are 2 very different things. My mother-in-law left me a voicemail about 4 months after everything came out. She said she had been thinking. She said she should have called me before she changed the locks. She said she hoped I knew she cared about me. It was the closest she came to a real accounting of what had happened. I listened to it twice and did not return the call immediately. When I did, I kept it short. I told her I appreciated her saying that. I told her I hoped it meant something the next time, not just this one. She said of course, with the slight breathlessness of someone who has said of course to avoid a longer conversation. That was fine. I had stopped needing the longer conversation. Theo asked me once, a few months later, whether I regretted building the document instead of just coming home and waiting for things to calm down. I told him I thought about that question. I told him the answer was no, but not because I wanted to be right, because waiting for things to calm down would have meant accepting a version of events that wasn't true, and once you accept the wrong version of yourself to keep the peace stops being real. You're just performing it, and I'd already spent too long performing calm when I should have been insisting on honest. He thought about that for a minute. Then he said, yeah, it wasn't poetry. But it was the most accurate thing either of us said that whole year. I still have the document. I never deleted it, not because I plan to use it for anything, but because there's something important about keeping a record of the time you refused to accept someone else's version of you as the final one. The photos are still in the folder. Adeline's account is still attached. Phoebe's message is still there. Truth has a strange shelf life. It doesn't expire. That's what makes it worth the trouble of finding it. And if you're wondering whether, after all of it, I think my in-laws love me, I think they love the version of Theo's life that's easiest to manage. I think I am sometimes part of that version and sometimes a complication in it, and which one I am on any given day depends less on me than I used to think it did. That's not love. That's proximity dressed up as love and hoping no one measures the difference. I stopped hoping they wouldn't notice. I started living in a way that didn't require them not to. That's the real ending. Not the document, not the photos, not the conversation in the living room where my sister-in-law sat back down instead of performing. The real ending was the morning I woke up in my own house, in my own bed, and realized I had spent all that energy finding proof not to show to anyone else, but to remind myself that I had been there, that I had been honest, that I had never been what they said I was. Sometimes you find the evidence for yourself first and everyone else second, and sometimes 2 words are the only answer a locked door deserves. No, never. I've thought a lot about what it actually takes to lock a door in someone's face, not physically. That part is easy. A deadbolt turns in less than a second. What I mean is the sequence of choices that gets a person to that moment. The decision to believe one voice without asking another. The decision to protect the story over the truth. The decision that someone else's discomfort matters more than your basic dignity. My sister-in-law didn't wake up one morning and decide to be cruel. That's what I came to understand over the months that followed. She had been making smaller decisions for a long time, each one reasonable enough on its own, each one pointing in the same direction. She had decided I was a threat before she had evidence. She had decided to look for proof before she knew what she was looking for. And when the proof didn't exist in the form she needed, she built the closest thing she could find and called it the real thing. That's not malice exactly. It's something quieter and in some ways more dangerous. It's fear doing the work of a plan. What I learned from Simone, not in a single conversation, but across weeks of bad coffee and honest talk, is that when you're in the middle of something that's unfair, the temptation is to match the energy, to be as loud as the accusation, to cry harder, argue louder, perform innocence with the same conviction they performed guilt. I almost did that. There were nights at her apartment when I drafted messages I never sent, where I imagined the confrontation I would have, rehearsed the version where I won the argument in the living room instead of just walking out of it. But you can't outperform someone who has been practicing longer than you. And more importantly, you shouldn't have to. What actually worked wasn't drama. It was patience applied to detail. It was Adeline remembering a face across a crowded party. It was a folder of archived photos with timestamps in the corner. It was Phoebe saying the truest thing anyone said through the whole ordeal. She wasn't investigating, she was writing. The moment I understood that, I understood what my actual job was. Not to fight the story, to replace it with something that didn't need anyone's performance to hold together. That's the thing about truth. It's not always fast. It doesn't always arrive in the moment you need it most. But it also doesn't require maintenance. You don't have to keep tending to it, adjusting it, making sure the details still line up. You just have to find it and let it be what it is. I think about the people in this story who acted from fear and what it cost them. My sister-in-law spent 8 months building something that collapsed in an afternoon once the photos existed. My mother-in-law made a decision in under a minute that took 4 months to even begin to repair. My father-in-law never quite found the words, and I think that silence is still somewhere between them, unsettled. The actions were theirs. The consequences followed naturally, without anyone orchestrating them. That's what I mean when I say I didn't want revenge. I wanted the thing they were all so afraid the truth would take from them to be less important than the truth itself. And eventually, it was. I think the hardest part of having integrity in an unfair situation is that it asks you to do the work without any guarantee of the outcome. You build the document not knowing if anyone will believe it. You stay calm, not knowing if calm will be rewarded. You refuse to perform innocence because you know you shouldn't have to, and that costs you something in the moment. What it gives you back is harder to name. Not vindication exactly, not peace, not immediately. Something more like solidity. The knowledge that you stayed true to what actually happened, even when the easier thing would have been to accept the version that asked less of you. Theo asked me once if I regretted how long it took. I told him I regretted the parts of myself I had been quietly shrinking to fit into his family's comfort. The locked door wasn't the wound. It was just where the wound finally became visible. You can only lock out someone who was already standing on the wrong side of a boundary you didn't know existed. The real work is figuring out where you actually belong and refusing to apologize for standing there.